An empire doesn't need an enemy to fall. History has taught us this over and over again. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to stop keeping a list, or for the doors of a warehouse to be forced shut. And one morning, the most powerful man in the state sits on his throne with no army to command and not a crust of bread to eat. This video is about how tax collection kept an empire alive throughout history, and conversely, how its collapse triggered the empire's downfall. We're traveling back to around 2100 BC, to the scorched earth of Mesopotamia. And there, carved into clay in cuneiform script, we find a system. A tax machine so detailed and systematic that even the world's largest corporations today would be envious. And I must say this, that system is still alive in your life today, and it's still running. The only difference is that it's on digital records instead of clay tablets. And it's not your sheep being taxed anymore. It's your bank account. Chapter 1. The Impossible Task of Ur-3. Those of you who watched our previous video already know. The greatest legacy the Sumerians left to the world was not money. It was debt. Before coins even existed, the Mesopotamians had recorded creditor-debtor relationships on clay tablets, writing the fundamental rules of commerce onto the very first pages of human history. If you haven't watched that video yet, I'd recommend checking the link in the cards section, because the roots of today's story run directly from there. Now let's bring Ur-Namma onto the stage. This king, who in 2112 BC made the city of Ur the undisputed power of Mesopotamia, was faced with a massive administrative challenge when he ascended the throne. He had to govern dozens of cities, hundreds of villages, and an estimated population of between 500,000 and 1 million people. And a significant portion of these people didn't plow fields or herd animals. Soldiers fought, priests prayed, scribes kept records, artisans produced, but none of them had a direct source of food. So who was going to feed these people? Who would equip the army? Who would finance the maintenance of temples, the cleaning of canals, the repair of roads? A modern state answers these questions with concepts like budgets, interest rates, and borrowing. But Ur-Namma had none of those tools. The only thing he had was this, knowing what people produced and taking a share of that production. That's all. And this simple idea carries the weight of a revolution in history, the BALA system. BALA roughly means exchange or cycle in Sumerian. But this word doesn't describe an innocent barter. It defines a compulsory and calculated contribution system. Every province, every city-state, every region was required to transfer a specific portion of what it produced to the center. This ratio was not arbitrary. It was determined in advance based on how much the province had produced that year, its population, and its geographic location, and it was recorded on a separate tablet. Gerzu was a grain producer, so it sent grain. Umma supplied reed and leather goods, Lagash raised horses and mules. Nippur contributed its religious authority and prestige to the system, because Nippur's endorsement was indispensable for the king's legitimacy. Adab sent fish and vegetable oil. Kazalu supplied textiles and wool thread. The system thus wove the entire economy into a network. Each node fed its strength into the system, and in return came under the management, security, and coordination of the system. So who managed this system in the field? This is where a class of scribes called Dubsar comes in. They weren't just clerks, they also took on the roles of analysts, auditors, and archivists. These individuals, who were skilled in cuneiform writing and mathematical calculations, made annual production estimates, calculated provincial contributions, and identified discrepancies by comparing central warehouses with local stocks. In short, these people were the first employees of history's first tax office. And these people too, ironically, were fed by the BALA itself, sustained by the very system they served. When archaeologists examined tens of thousands of clay tablets from the Ur-3 period, the numbers that emerged were staggering. The system collected approximately 188 million liters of grain per year. To put that in perspective, this quantity is large enough to cover a significant portion of a densely populated modern metropolis's annual grain needs, and that's just grain. Animals, hides, wood, fish oil, and cloth were kept in separate records. Not a single item was overlooked. Not a single province's contribution was recorded as approximate. Everything was expressed in exact numbers. But hold on for a moment. Because what makes this system truly remarkable is not the quantities collected, it's how those quantities were tracked. What I'm about to tell you will show you just how small any logistics company today really is. Chapter 2: History's First Cargo Tracking System. Puzrish-Dagan. Located near Nippur, on what is today Iraqi soil, this town left behind between 10,000 and 12,000 clay tablets. And these are only the ones that could be found. These tablets contain what are perhaps the most systematic logistics records in history. But it's also worth noting that these tablets were not stored in a random dump. They were preserved in a planned, deliberate state archive. The Sumerians didn't accumulate these documents haphazardly. They preserved them intentionally. What was Puzrish-Dagan's primary function? It was, of course, a central distribution hub. Animals collected from provinces across all of Mesopotamia, cattle, sheep, goats, oxen, first arrived here. This was both a customs point and a counting and weighing station, and at the same time a redistribution center. Every animal that arrived was recorded here. Which province it came from, which local official delivered it, on what date it arrived, what its physical condition was, and to which temple or palace it was to be dispatched. And this chain of records was never broken throughout the animal's journey. When it moved from Puzrish-Dagan to the next stop, a new official would draft a new tablet, stamp it with their seal, and sign it. This chain continued unbroken until the animal was slaughtered in a temple kitchen or sacrificed at a palace ceremony. Archaeologists were able to lay certain tablets side by side and trace the entire journey of a single animal on a map, from beginning to end. Think about that. In 2000 BC, the biography of a single sheep could be written. Now, as you think about that, imagine this. You've made an online purchase. You open the courier company's app. You can see which warehouse your package is in, which vehicle it's been loaded onto, where the driver is right now, and how many minutes it will be before it reaches your door. Maybe a barcode is being scanned, maybe a GPS signal is being tracked. Puzrish-Dagan was exactly that. A cargo tracking system carved into clay, sealed, and archived. There was no software, no internet, no barcode. But the logic was completely identical. Every item would be tracked, every transfer documented, nothing would be lost. The tool changed. The need for oversight did not. King Shulgi expanded this system across the entire empire and took it one step further. Ascending the throne in 2094 BC, Shulgi went down in history not merely as a ruler, but as a systematic administrative genius. One of his first acts was to establish standard weights and measures. This may sound ordinary, but it was a revolutionary step. 1 gur of grain coming from Girsu now meant exactly the same amount as 1 gur of grain in Ur. The door was largely closed on regional fraud attempts and short measures. Shulgi also established a courier road system across the empire. By creating regular lodging and horse relay stations at set intervals, he built the infrastructure for a messenger to travel from Ur to Nippur in a short time. Thanks to these roads, tax collection orders were relayed quickly, and provincial dispatch confirmations reached the center without delay. Historians describe this system as the prototype, roughly 2,000 years earlier, of the Romans' famous cursus publicus postal system. And it wasn't just grain and animals being carried on the back of this system, labor was also part of it. This unit, referred to in tablets as gurush, represented one person's labor for one day. Temple construction, canal excavation, harvest transport, all of it was calculated in gurush and recorded. How many gurush were spent on a canal project, which province those gurush came from, how many people worked for how many days, all of it was documented. In other words, the state wasn't just taxing goods, it was taxing human time, and it was tracking that too without missing a beat, on clay tablets. One researcher studying these tablets said, "These records are as consistent as if they'd come out of modern accounting software." And they were right. Because the scribes of the Shulgi era would consolidate the contributions of all provinces into a central summary tablet at the end of each year. These summary tablets were, in today's terms, no different from annual consolidated budget reports. Who gave what, who gave too little, who gave too much, all together, recorded comparatively. But now I'm going to tell you about one of history's most striking economic collapses. And pay attention, this collapse did not begin with a war, nor with a famine. It began simply because they stopped keeping a list. What a bitter collapse it was. Chapter 3, 1,200-fold, history's first hyperinflation disaster, 2028 BC. Ibbi-Sin, the last link in the Ur-3 dynasty, ascends the throne. The system he inherited from his ancestors is perfect, but only on paper. In reality, the cracks have long since appeared, and they have opened too deep to be covered by any amount of paint. Ibbi-Sin was forced to wage war on 3 fronts simultaneously. Pressure from Elam in the east was increasing every year. Amorite tribes in the west were pushing at the borders and occasionally crossing them. And from the north, small city-states that had previously been vassals of Ur-3 began declaring their independence one by one. These threats were each difficult enough to handle separately. When they all exploded at once, the empire's governing capacity was utterly destroyed, and it was at that point that the BALA cracked. Because of the conflicts on the borders, some provinces lost the routes they needed to transport their grain to the center. Some cited rising security costs as a reason to reduce their contributions. And some, seeing that Ibbi-Sin's authority was weakening, made an opportunistic calculation. The thought that no one can come to hold us accountable anymore began to take hold. Shipments began to arrive late, first one by one. Then they were partially cut. Then they stopped altogether. Ibbi-Sin tried to control this process. From the correspondence reflected in tablets, we can see that the king sent stern warnings to some governors, made promises, and even offered rewards. But authority had already been shaken. And once authority is shaken, written warnings have no meaning left. Some of his letters received no reply at all. And at that moment, the domino tiles toppled each other. The amount of grain entering the central warehouses dropped rapidly. But the number of people who depended on those warehouses hadn't changed. Soldiers, artisans, priests, palace officials, dubsars. Everyone was receiving their monthly rations from the same warehouse. The state began buying grain from the open market to cover the shortfall. But there were other buyers doing the same. Small merchants, temples, panicking families. Demand grew like an avalanche. Supply stayed fixed. And so, prices shot up. The tablets found by archaeologists document this disaster in numbers. In normal times, 1 gur of grain, roughly 300 liters, cost 1 shekel of silver. By the end of the Ibbi-Sin period, the price of the same amount had reached 20 talents. That is an approximately 1,200-fold price increase. To translate this into today's terms, imagine a loaf of bread you normally buy for $3, suddenly costing $3,600. Your salary hasn't changed. The money in your bank is the same. But now you can't even buy a week's worth of food with it. That was the picture Ur-3 found itself in. This economic collapse brought social disintegration with it. In texts from this period, historians encounter a phrase they had never seen before. People had started to abandon the cities, because staying in the city meant being dependent on the state's ever-shrinking military rations. A farmer who returned to their land could at least harvest something from their own field. This wave of migration further reduced the artisan and laborer population in the cities, which in turn lowered production and pushed prices even higher. The vicious cycle fed itself. In 2004 BC, the Elamites made their move. But this time, not as conquerors, as opportunists, because the empire had already rotted from within. The army had disbanded, unable to receive rations. The city walls had fallen into disrepair. The people were too exhausted to care who was coming, let alone resist an enemy. When the Elamites entered Ur, they encountered almost no resistance. Ibbi-Sin was placed in chains and taken into exile. This last king, who had inherited the most advanced tax and logistics system in the world, was buried in the dusty pages of history along with the collapse of that system. And one more thing should be added. The fall of Ur became the subject of a lamentation poem in Sumerian. This literary text, known as the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, depicts the city's ruin as both a divine abandonment and a human helplessness. It describes temples emptying, streets filling with corpses, and even the strongest walls proving useless. When you read this poem today, you feel what history has told us, not in words, but in numbers. When a civilization's tax system stops, it is not only the state that collapses. Everything that state created, its art, its literature, its architecture, its culture, all collapses together. Didn't a sense of familiarity stir inside you as you listened to this story? Today, which countries' budget deficits are being debated? Which states' tax revenues are under discussion? Which economies are being labeled unsustainable? History may not repeat itself, but the skeletal structure of economic collapse has not changed since 2000 BC. Conclusion, closing, and next video teaser. Today we've seen this. On the surface, a tax is a transfer of money. But looked at deeply, it is a contract of trust. The state says, "Give to me, and I will feed you, protect you, and help you grow." As long as this contract is accepted, the system works. The moment it is rejected, or the moment the state can no longer keep its promise, the system collapses. And everything collapses along with it. The Mesopotamians learned this the hard way in 2000 BC. And without knowing this lesson today, you cannot truly understand any modern economic debate. The tax policies of states, the decisions of central banks, inflation figures, all of these are nothing more than modern versions of that old equation written on clay tablets. If you found this video valuable, and I think you did, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every new video in our series illuminates a little more of those dark intersection points where economics and history meet. Hitting the like button and leaving a comment both motivates us and helps this content reach more people. Tell us in the comments which historical economic event you're curious about. Maybe the next video will come from there. And now, a small teaser. The wealth that the Ur III Empire accumulated thanks to this perfect tax system didn't just sit in one place. It had to move. Caravans crossed deserts, merchants risked their lives, fought off bandits in mountain passes, and on journeys that lasted hundreds of days, had no choice but to trust their partners. So how did these people protect their wealth? Who provided them with financial security? And what clever mechanism lay behind this trade network? Our next video, Trade Without Borders, the Financial Security of Caravans. If you want to be notified when that video is ready, turn on the bell right now. See you in that video.